Thanks for tuning in to the You're the Cure podcast. This podcast was created to teach you how to take authority over your health. Another great way to do this is by signing up to be a Veritas Wellness member, where you can be equipped and educated on how to reverse chronic diseases and to live life abundantly. If you choose Veritas Wellness, we'll walk alongside you, provide hours of wellness content, as well as educational courses from Dr. Ben. We would love to partner with you and teach you how to not need a doctor. Sign up today at veritaswellnessmember.com. And with all of that in mind, let's jump right into this week's episode of You're the Cure.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of You're the Cure. I'm Dr. Ben Edwards. Got a great show today. J. Warner Wallace is back, a repeat guest. First talked to Jay a number of years ago, a book that was so impactful in my life, Cold Case Christianity. And I wanted to set this up a little bit because some listeners may say, hey, why are we talking to a detective, retired detective, about cold case crimes and the truth in crime? And his new book right here I have, The Truth in True Crime. What's true crime have to do with your health? And so let me connect these dots real quick. And if you've been listening over the past many months, you'll see I've really been pushing hard on trying to connect these dots on the mitochondria, which pretty much everybody's agreeing now that Alzheimer's, heart disease, cancer, autoimmune, autism, you name it, across the board, it's all inflammatory-based disease processes. This inflammation is coming from your carburetor, your mitochondria, not working efficiently. That mitochondria's got to take fuel and oxygen and spark plug, that's minerals, to make energy, and it also makes free radicals. When you don't make enough energy and you make too many free radicals, that creates inflammation, oxidative stress in the mitochondria. You do that across hundreds of mitochondria in one cell, that cell's not going to work right. And that'll manifest as what we call diseases, migraines and heart attacks and cancer. But all that's because that cell is dysfunctional, because the carburetor is dysfunctional. And as we well know, for 12 years of preaching nutrition, you got to have high quality nutrition. You got to have oxygenation through movement. You've got to have minerals. You've got to have hydration. We know the natural. But what we've come to learn in 12 years is you hit a ceiling. You cannot eat and exercise your way to total mitochondrial efficiency and health. And the crazy thing, for me, grew up Christian, grew up in a religious home, hearing the word taught, but through religious goggles. So it did not impact my heart. And it's our heart that actually influences the mitochondria. Is it going to take that fuel and that oxygen and those minerals and rev at a high RPM, fight or flight mode? Or is it going to rev down here at a good RPM, rest and digest, sympathetic, parasympathetic? And we are not designed to be in this chronic sympathetic dominance. And when you are and you're redlining that mitochondria day after day after day, nutrition and hydration and movement are only going to get you so far. It's really the filters or the goggles you're looking at life through. It's your heart. And in the word, it says it over and over and over and over. As your heart, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. And out of a merry heart flows life, and all issues of life come out of your heart, and the power of life and death in your tongue. Our heart, our beliefs, our thoughts, our core beliefs about God, self, and others, really, if you boil it down, is where we've landed right now. This is so key. And so one of the foundational things on that is God, obviously. Is there a God? If there is a God, what's he like? Is he personal? Is he loving? And all these questions that come in. And if you have question marks on that, which I had a bunch growing up, and that's, again, why we're bringing J. Warner Wallace on the show, because as I've said on the show before, when I hit about 30 and we couldn't get pregnant for 24 months, and I decided to go to this Bible that I'd grown up with, but read it from a lens of desperation, and saw the verse, seek ye first the kingdom. And it hit me, we were seeking a baby for 24 months of pregnancy and not the kingdom. And then I asked what the kingdom is, but my very next confession was, I believe, but help me with my unbelief. Because I also sat under a religion called Darwinism for 12 years in my education to be a doctor. And that had a huge influence on me. Lots of doubt and unbelief. So I found these two guys. One guy was a journalist up in Chicago who did not believe in God and went to prove his wife wrong because she did believe in God and took the kids to church. And he used investigative journalism skills to go prove his wife wrong. And it turned out after all his investigation, she was right. He believed evidence showed there is a God and it is a loving God, and the God of the Bible is true and is the God of all. Well, then there was this other guy on the other in Los Angeles, and he was a cold case detective. And I believe, and I'll let him speak for himself here in just a sec, as my memory serves me, his wife decided we need to take the kids to church to raise them up in a kind of a moral atmosphere. And being a good husband, he said, okay. And he sat there in the pew and he listened to this preacher talking about a guy that got murdered. And there were eyewitnesses to the murder. And these eyewitnesses wrote it down. Well, that's what a cold case detective studies. They study old, everyone's dead, it's long since gone. It's a mystery of what happened here, but there's a lot of eyewitness accounts written down by the detectives at the time. So a cold case detective is going to comb through all that, and there's certain points that they can look at, certain things and clues in these written accounts that they can pick up on, these clues that say, man, this is really an accurate statement, or no, there's holes all through this. So there's actual evidentiary mechanisms in the mind of these detectives that they use. And so our guest, J. Warner Wallace, went through this procedure in his mind and went through the scriptures, obviously the murder, Jesus, the disciples writing the accounts. And he came to the conclusion that book is real. It's supernaturally inspired. It's amazing. And that's where I got, guys. So that once I got that clear in my intellect that this is true, now we got this foundation of I can dig into it. And when this verse says, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he, I can actually put stock in that. That carries weight. That could actually mean I need to examine my heart, what's influencing that heart to think a certain way that might lead to conflict and fight or flight in my life, leading to my mitochondria not burning fuel and oxygen appropriately, leading to inflammation, leading to disease. Boiling it down. Proverbs 4:20, don't let this word depart from your eyes, your ears, your heart. It is healing to all your flesh. Guys, it is all through that book. So can we trust the book, believe the book? J. Warner Wallace, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining, coming back to the show again.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. I mean, it's interesting because if you just looked at the studies that are done in all of these areas that I talk about in this book, you'll find that, the somatic response, the relationship between how we think and how we live and our physical health, our mental health and our physical health, those two things are almost always in all the studies I cite in this book, mentioned in sequence. Like there's definitely a connection upon, and it's interesting to me that the secular world, people who don't believe that there is a God, recognize that your thoughts are pivotal to your physical well-being. So it's something that's not just us who are Christians who read the scripture who recognize this, but now I see more and more that people are writing about it because they recognize it as well.
Yeah. I've mentioned Dr. Joe Mercola, who I don't think is a believer, but he's a #1 natural health doctor on the internet, been writing a newsletter for 30 years, and he's just considered the guru. And just this year came out with the same conclusion, guys, you'll hit a ceiling with diet and exercise and supplements. And he's going after it from a different point of view, but joy is kind of the term. If you don't have joy, your cells aren't going to function right now. He's trying to get joy through a different avenue. But maybe let's start, Jay, with a little of the background. I know you've been on the show before, guys. I encourage you to go on our archive page on the website, veritaswellnessmember.com, resources, podcasts, and you can see all the guests we've had over the years. Type in J. Warner Wallace. You'll see the initial interview. But just maybe to summarize that, because that was really focused on that first book, Cold Case Christianity, but give some of that backstory that I kind of alluded to just now with you and your wife and going to church and you weren't a believer and how you got to where you do believe. And then, of course, we'll get into the new book.
Yeah, well, Susie was interested because we had our kids in preschool. Back, here in California, that was not uncommon, and probably still isn't uncommon that people want to prepare their kids for elementary. I always think it's kind of funny that we're preparing our kids for the first experience in school that's designed to prepare our kids. So I don't even know why we do it, but we do preschool. And a lot of here locally where we were, the only preschools, well, the ones that we knew were most recommended were ones that were religious. They were offered in churches. And so that's probably not uncommon that you have a lot of folks going to church preschools who are not Christians. And that was our situation. But then when the kids finally get to elementary school, I thought, well, okay, we're done with that. We'll probably never visit another church. But Susie was like, well, should we be done with that? Should we continue to, like, they've been exposed to this? It might be helpful. Might seem odd that they're now no longer exposed to this. So I decided I would go with her the same way that my dad, who's not a believer, would be more than happy to go and attend a church function because he thinks if it's good for you and you think you're getting some value in it, good for you. I'll just support you. And that was my view with my wife. I'm happy to go if you wanted to go. I think she was definitely more interested in things beyond the our at least faith-based things than I was. So I would have said, great, I'll go and attend the same way you would attend if she wanted to go to if I asked her to attend a sporting event that she has no interest in, she would still go for me. So it was kind of the same thing in reverse. So I get there and the pastor describes Jesus as the smartest man who ever lived. And that was what provoked me because for selfish reasons, I thought, well, if that's true, what's so smart about him? I needed to buy a Bible to find out. So I bought a Pew Bible and it's sitting here on my shelf and I went through it forensically and just kind of used the only skill set I was familiar with, which is, there are clearly claims. It's not like this is a series of proverbial claims from Jesus. He's not giving us advice on how to live. The Gospels are claims about an historical event called the resurrection in the 3 years that preceded it. So the question then becomes, did these things actually happen? They're being recorded as though they happened at a particular place in history, a particular time in history, at a particular place in the Roman Empire. So these are claims that are like other eyewitness claims. And you even have people like Luke who says, hey, I wasn't here for this stuff, but I'm talking to the eyewitnesses. I just recorded what they said. It's like a report writer who's taking a report from an eyewitness. I know how to test those. So I simply tested the claims and I describe all that in Cold Case Christianity. And that's at least how I got to a place where I was no longer belligerent to the claims of the New Testament. In other words, once you believe that you can trust what the Bible is saying about Jesus, you're far more likely to listen to what it says about you. And I just needed to get to that point where I could trust what it was saying about Jesus. And so I wrote the first book many years later because I really wasn't intending to write a book. I was just working with high schoolers because my kids were that age, and I by this time had already attended seminary. It was many years after I became a Christian, and I was working with Sean McDowell, who's an apologist himself, and we were preparing his high school class to go to UC Berkeley to engage atheists on the campus of UC Berkeley. And I had done this a number of times before, and I was just teaching his students what I had been teaching my own youth ministry, where I volunteered because my kids were that age, and I had been teaching those students for probably 5 years by that time. And Sean saw it and said, you should write a book about this. And so I wrote the first book, which was Cold Case Christianity. And that kind of led me down a path of my publisher of writing a number of books that kind of take a similar approach to the evidence for. But even by that time, if I'm honest with you, I was already like, this was not, once you've examined the evidence, you move on. You move on to the next thing in life. And I needed to examine that evidence so I could enter into this worldview called Christianity, which I did. But by the time I wrote about the evidence, I was probably 10 years after I was already, it had been 10 years since that investigation really mattered to me in terms of stepping across that first line. Now I was really trying to figure out, okay, so how does Christianity explain the world? Like, what is it? What next? What now? Let's just put it this way. At some point after you're saved, it's about discipleship. Like, how do I learn how to bend my knee to the teaching of Jesus, since I already know he's who he said he was? So that's where I really was. And I always wanted to write this book because this book is really more about not so much just about, is Christianity true? It's about, is Christianity good? And it turns out that Christianity is both true and good. You might think those things have to kind of coexist, but not always. There are some true things that aren't good and some good things that aren't true. So we wanted to know, is it both true and good? And I think young people want to know. So this is basically 15 crime stories, 15 rules for life that will contribute to your human flourishing. I've supported all of these with all the studies. They're all in the footnotes, and also showed you how in this book how those attributes of human flourishing are really very ancient claims. You could discover them with current studies, but it turns out they're all biblical. They're all things that God has written for us, and that if we will simply embrace them, every dimension of our human existence will improve, because we would actually be kind of living and breathing and acting in the world based on the design of the designer, rather than something else we've designed for ourselves. So that's kind of what this book is about. And so the truth and true crime are really just, kind of 15 rules for life that you discover investigating death.
Yeah. Well, the beauty of what you've done in the book and taking these real life examples, these cases, and then connecting these dots and showing here's exactly, what this is saying from the word. And that's what I find in science, in the scientific literature I look at, that like, man, we got to have all this intellectual proof and knowledge. Now we can go believe, oh yeah, that was in the word from thousands of years ago.
Right.
But I think God's gracious, meeting us Western-minded, intellectual, left brain, black and white, facts, evidence. Okay, here you go. Here's a bunch. So maybe that leads to my next question, because obviously you're a detective or reformer in crime, true crime. And the name of the book, again, guys, The Truth in True Crime. Highly recommend you go get it. Why do you think people are so interested in crime? I mean, it just fascinates people. Our news, I know the news is always trying to get clicks, and fear seems to drive everything. But what's this thing on crime and people being fascinated with it?
I think a couple of reasons. I think one, we all, just on a very practical level, we love mysteries, and we love to be able to try to unpuzzle. Even if it's not a crime mystery, we just love movies where it's not quite clear, and the movie is kind of inviting us to try to figure it out. And crime stories, especially cases you're trying to solve, they're definitely inviting you to figure it out. And that's why I've been on a number of Dateline episodes, but the Dateline producer almost always is trying to present the case in the least straightforward way possible, so that the viewer is left kind of wondering, even though at that point in the investigation we weren't left, we already had figured it out. But what they're trying to do is get the viewer to be hanging and not quite sure until the sixth segment. If there are 6 segments in the show, there are 8-minute segments and there's 6 of them. Well, then you're trying to get them to not really land it until the 6th one.
Right.
And you almost want to kind of lead them astray in segment 3, before you kind of circle back to the real suspect. Well, why? Because I think it's trying to leverage that nature that we have of wanting to be the first to fix it, the first to solve it, to beat the person sitting next to you. Oh, I know who it is already. That kind of is part of it. I think another aspect of it, though, is that we are interested in human behavior when it serves as a cautionary tale. We are interested in, how do I prevent this from happening to me? There's an aspect of that, I think, in it. There's also an aspect of it that's very prideful, that we enjoy watching people who make a train wreck of something, because we like to say to ourselves, oh, I would never have done that. I'm so much better than that. Right. So I think it's those 3 things in some combination that typically drive the interest in true crime. But whatever it is, you do see that, this book has been trending in a couple of different areas. It's been trending in self-improvement books. It's been trending in Christian apologetics books, but it's also, I think this morning was trending as the #1 new release in serial killer true accounts. Okay. So what is that about? I think it's just because this is one of those areas. Let's put it this way. I think most people, when they ask us about Christianity and about our Christian worldview, it typically is going to happen in a point of struggle, in a point of crisis. And this is why Peter in 1 Peter, there's this passage in 1 Peter 3 that all of us as Christian casemakers kind of lean on, where Peter says, be ready to give the reason for the hope you have in Jesus with gentleness and respect. But the context of 1 Peter, that what he's writing there, is really the context of struggle and persecution and suffering, because it turns out that most questions about God are not detached from our human experiences. And so that's why I really think that these kinds of conversations you have about these 15 topics in this book are far more likely to occur than conversations you're going to have about just rotely, what's the evidence for Christianity? I think more people are concerned about, well, how do I live? Why would a God allow this to happen to me? And if there is a God, what is he trying to do with this moment? It's trying to figure out how Christianity, if it does in fact make sense of reality. And I think that's what this book is trying to demonstrate, that yeah, it makes sense of reality, even the worst moments in reality, true crime cases, and it's something that we ought to embrace and surrender to.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned some modern scientific literature, published data in relationship to what you discovered about human nature in these crimes.
Yeah.
Kind of let's dive into some of those, the things you've discovered.
Yeah. I think that, but most of us want to know the one human. It's true what you were saying about how all of these ways we think impact the way we feel physically, and the impact actually physical realities you can measure with material sciences, right? And that if you think a certain way, it provides a certain physical benefit, and longevity and mental health are often connected in the same study to when those improve, when your mental health improves, you see improvements in physical health. And so you'll find them in the same study, how both of these things are rising in parallel. And a lot of that to me was powerful, because I think the one common feature we all experience, the one common thing about our human experience, regardless of our ethnicity, our family structure, everyone is going to suffer at some point. And if you're in your 40s and you think, well, that's not true for everyone, well, just because you're in your 40s. But trust me, it's coming, because most of us, I mean, none of us gets out without trauma. None of us gets out without losing somebody important, or suffering a physical illness, or an accident changing something. I mean, or you don't get the job, or you get laid off, or you get divorced, or or your kids get divorced. I mean, there's like 1,000 different ways that life can offer a gut punch. And how we respond to the suffering is key. And there's many ways you could respond. So I think in the end, one of the chapters I wanted to write most importantly, was this chapter on trauma, this making sense of suffering, because I've seen it so many times in my work with couples, because we spend a lot of time in working with Billy Graham Association with couples who have suffered trauma. Typically, they're police couples who have suffered through a critical incident. They're severely injured. They barely get through it alive, and then they start to see problems in their marriage, or see things that are now a struggle that weren't a struggle before. And then it's what's about a lot of this book really comes out of that work for the last 5 years, that I've really zeroed in on, like, what are the key things that people lean on their faith for, and ought to lean on their faith, because it turns out that it offers the best resources. Christianity offers the best resource when it comes to suffering, hands down. There is no other worldview that will guide you through a suffering moment as well as the Christian worldview. So that's why there's a couple chapters in this book where I'm really just focused on that. The idea that, hey, you're going to be going along in life, and you're going to be going along a certain level of functioning, and then you're going to suffer some trauma. And if you stay down on your knees because it's knocked you to your knees, then we would call that PTSD. And many of the people I deal with have already been clinically diagnosed with PTSD. And they're having all kinds of physical outcomes based on how they're struggling in their head. It's not just they have a physical disability now. Some of them don't. They just experience something they can't get out of their head. They've seen something. I get it. I understand it. And it has a physical consequence. And they have physical symptoms as a result of the PTSD that are now debilitating in some way. So what do you do with these folks? How do you help them? How does anyone get back to resiliency, which is that same level of you were at before? Or I want even better than that. I want post-traumatic growth. I want you to come back on the backside and even perform at a higher level than you were before this event. Well, how do you do that? Well, the clinical studies on it are pretty clear that the secular world calls this meaning making. Is because it turns out that what is trauma? Trauma is simply, this is where people don't get it. It's not just the physical injury that's traumatizing. It's that you had a view of the world and a view of yourself that was completely shattered by the event. You thought the world was one way. You thought your life would be one way. You thought your marriage would be one way. And then this event occurs that completely destroys your idea of what the world really is like. It's when your worldview is shattered that you suffer trauma. So it turns out that the response to trauma is always going to be a worldview response. It's
Mm.
not just that you're disabled, because there are people like Johnny Erickson Tada who are critically disabled at 18, yet actually thrive on the backside, because she recognizes it's not necessarily just the disability, the physical aspect of her injury. It's how she then rethinks and makes sense of what's happened to her. I don't call it meaning making as a Christian. I call it meaning finding, because what you're trying to do is figure out, like, what is my story really? Maybe I had the story wrong to begin with. Maybe the book isn't the way I thought it was. I got to figure out what's the real book of my life, and where am I in that? Which chapter am I in? Because I never thought this chapter would be part of my book, but here it is. And now I got to figure out, well, maybe this is the last chapter and I'm just done. Or maybe this is the climactic chapter from which something beautiful is going to emerge. Like, finding the meaning in the overarching story is something that Christianity does better than any other worldview. Because if atheism is true, none of us have really any meaning to our lives. Why would you think that your insignificant start to life, you came out of the dirt through an evolutionary process, completely insignificant, and your insignificant death when you return back to the dirt, would somehow be at the bookends of a significant life? No, if your start is insignificant, your end's insignificant. Everything in the middle is also equally meaningless,
Mm-hmm.
because there is no overarching story, no purpose for you being here. And no one's going to remember you in 4 generations. And certainly when the universe suffers a heat death, no one's going to remember any of us. If atheism is true, we've got a pretty bleak view of suffering.
Yeah.
But if atheism is not true, and there's an overarching story written by God and your chapter is in it, it's just a matter of you figuring out, what chapter are you in God's story? Find your place in the story. So
Mhm.
meaning finding is what, statistically, you see it in all the studies, is what leads to post-traumatic growth. Do we want post-traumatic growth or not? Well, it's going to mean not just changing like what we're taking or what we're doing for our body and our injury. It's going to take something that's going to adjust the way we think about the world, the way we view the world. Because it turns out meaning making, if you're an atheist, is still what they're striving for. Not, antidote taking. It's meaning making. That's a very different approach. And that's what you're talking about. Is that it turns out that there's a connection between your thoughts and your physical health.
Mhm.
And that connection, I think, is powerful enough for me to want to at least look at Christianity with new eyes, if I'm somebody who's rejected it for all these years. Because it turns out that view of the world will lead to the most best opportunity you have to flourish behind a trauma.
Yeah. In all your years of investigating crimes, but murders in particular, I mean, that's the ultimate conflict between two humans.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the take home or biggest lessons about human behavior, human nature, that you've learned from those that the audience could take away from this book?
Well, I think one thing, and I talk about this in a chapter that mentions a guy named Santa Claus. It's about worship. It turns out that almost all the crimes that I'm investigating, and certainly murders, are really a matter of misplaced worship.
Mm.
It's idolatry, and that's really another way of saying misplaced worship. In other words, that you're focused on something that you're making the center of your universe when you don't really need to do that. If I wasn't a Christian, I would say the same thing. I would say, hey, you're probably making that too big a deal that you're now willing to kill for it. Well, when you're making something too big a deal that you're now willing to kill for it, that is basically a definition of idolatry. Because the question becomes, like, what am I willing to let be my master?
Mm.
And when we worship, and we're all worshipers, we're all innately worshipers. We all have something that we would say is the biggest and best and most important thing, the thing that we are willing to sacrifice our money for. We eagerly await it. We are willing to let it be our master. And it turns out, whatever it is, and by the way, if it's not God, if it's something he's created, that's by definition idolatry from our perspective as Christians. So it turns out, and idolatry always falls into 3 categories. Either you're worshiping something in the pursuit of sex, money, material objects, or power, authority, respect, achievement, performance. something like that's about it. That's a power issue. And so those are the three areas that I see people commit murders for all the time. And it's because, and over the smallest thing, there's a chapter in this book where I talk about a guy who was part of our homeless community, and he was killed for what amounted to next to nothing. I mean, this guy basically was killed by somebody who felt like he had been, look, this is a guy who didn't have anything in the way of money, sex, or power. Like, what are you going to take from him? Why would you kill a guy who can't offer you anything in these three areas? But it turned out what had happened was another member of the homeless community. These were both recyclers. They would recycle cans and bottles, and they would do this every day until they could afford enough to maybe buy one meal and buy alcohol. And that's what they would do every day. By 2 o'clock, they'd be at the recycling center, cashing in their recycling. Well, this guy who killed this member of our community, he did so because this guy had encroached into his alley, into one of his alleys that he typically would harvest trash cans out of this particular alley. And this guy, that was called Santa Claus because he looked like Santa Claus. He had started to kind of collect cans out of there. And I'm thinking at the time, working the case, like, what are we talking about here? $1? $2 in recyclable material? And that's enough for you to kill a guy? Well, he confronted him at the recycling center, and the Santa Claus basically kind of blew him off. He thought it was ridiculous as well, and so he told him, basically just ignored him. He didn't really say anything back to him. He just kind of whatever. Well, now he had offended his authority and respect in the community of other canners. So he had triggered two things. Number one, he was basically getting money that this guy thought was his, even though it was very little. And he had disrespected him, even though it was very little. Well, this is what happens when we make things an idol, is it doesn't take much to make us mad. As a matter of fact, that's one way to identify your idols. Like if you're reading on social media and you're looking at the news and something's making you really mad because you're reading about it, good chance this is an idol. This is something that you've now made more important than your relationship with God. This is like your thing is to get online every day and get mad at things you don't like in the world. These things can become idols. And this is what happened with this guy. So he was willing to go out and stab this guy to death for basically not even saying anything mean to him and collecting an extra $1 or $2 a day, if that. So I think that's why we have to be careful about our idols. And every case I've ever worked is somebody who has misplaced his worship.
Yeah. Well, in another part of the book, talking about relationships, friendships, so many crimes related to poor relationships, poor friendships.
Right.
I would think, kind of dovetailing off what you just said, I would think kind of boils down to those same core things. Yeah.
No doubt. I mean, this is something you see all the time, that usually it's, sadly, you've typically when someone does something terrible to you, it's probably somebody who you've allowed access. Not always, but often it's somebody who you've had access to for years and never thought of them as a threat or a danger, and then one day things change, and so it's almost always somebody who's in your circle. And when we work a crime, the first thing we start with is, who do you know? Who knows you? Who would do this to you? Rather than start with what strangers might do this to you. Well, why? Because it turns out that your relationships matter. And there's another story in this book of a woman who was killed by somebody she would have said was her best friend. So it turns out that although relationships lead to flourishing and they improve your metric. So this largest study done about human contentment and happiness over a 60-year period, I cite this in the book. This study demonstrated that at the top of that list is relationships. So it turns out they can really contribute to your flourishing, but they have to be a certain kind of relationship. Not every relationship is going to contribute to your flourishing. It certainly didn't for this woman. And so I wanted to know, like, what is it? Like, what are the kind? Now you might think, well, I kind of know. Well, really? Well, maybe. I think there are three things that the studies show. Number one, the kinds of relationships that contribute to flourishing are probably not going to be from large numbers of people you know. It's usually going to be a small group of friends who have poured into you. Why is that the case? Because the second thing you need is a deep diver. You need somebody who knows you so well and whose friendship you so value that you're not going to push them away, even when they speak the truth to you. And it's truth tellers. It's deep divers who know you so well. They know all of your dirt. that they can say to you, no, you shouldn't do that. Why'd you do that? That wasn't nice. That you're not just going to shun, because these are close friendships. You only have 3 or 4 like this. You're not going to just kick them to the curb. You're actually going to listen to them. So it turns out the first 2 elements of flourishing friendships are a small number of people who are deeply connected. But the third aspect, because this woman was killed by one of her small group of friends who was deeply connected to her, and yet she still died at the hands of this alleged friend. And that's the third element, which I think that really no one wants to study deeply in the literature, but it is true. They'll kind of hint around it, and I've listed the literature in the book, is that you have to have virtue. And that's the trick, is that it's a small number of deeply connected, virtuous friends that actually lead to flourishing. But the question, of course, is going to be, well, what does it mean to be virtuous? Like, who gets to decide what's virtuous? And there's the trick right there. That's why the Christian worldview does a better job than any other worldview. Because look, if I'm going to decide what's virtuous on the basis of groupthink, well, then every gang member I've ever met, do you really want that group to tell you what's right and wrong? Because most of those guys would say, well, yeah, of course I went over there and killed him. Like, he came over here and did this thing over here first, and he knows, but he knows the code. If you do that, this is the response you're going to get. I would expect it. I wouldn't be upset if he did it to me, because that's the code. And so I did it to him. Okay, well, this is the problem with a group deciding the code, is that you can often decide things are good that aren't really good. So this is why the Christian worldview says, well, no, there's going to have to be a code of virtue of what is good and bad that transcends groups, that is going to have to come from something objectively grounded. So that's why I think in the end, some of these things, and friendships is one of them. I think just the notion of wisdom is another one, but I think friendship for sure is going to require you to think long and hard about what is good before you just decide to because let's face it, friends are so critical. We are such contagious creature that we will take on the nature of the people we're closest to. As a matter of fact, that's why word of mouth is the best way to spread anything. But because it turns out that you trust your friends, you listen to your friends, you want to become like your friends. There's another chapter in this book. I never thought about this connection really until I wrote it, but that talks about how otherly we are. It's really the source of injustice, is that we push away from people who are not like us. The data all reveals that we are far more likely to bond to gather around, even to marry people who are like us or like our family than we are to this idea that opposites attract is not really true, unless you mean like this phone has got a front side and a back side. So there's opposites here, but they're the same phone. Kind of the same thing happens in terms of relationships. We are far more likely to be attracted to people who are like us. And that's why I think your friends matter, because you're going to either attract to somebody who's like you, or you're going to become like the person who's attracted to you. So one of these two things is going to end up happening. We have to be careful who we select.
Yeah. Could you talk about, I forget which chapter it was, I'm looking right now at the book, but forgiveness. Obviously, if we're talking about relationships and friends and, conflict arises, but you get into that in one of these books, but talk about that a little bit.
Well, a lot of it is it's so if you're familiar with your Bible, you know, it serves a certain passage that illustrates this really well. And I'm pretty sure I use it in this book as well. But it turns out that the least forgiving people you know are people who don't think they need to be forgiven for anything. It's just a common rule, is that if you don't think you need forgiveness, well, then you're not likely to offer it to anybody else. Why do you stubbornly hold your ground with your spouse? Because you think you're right, and he's wrong or she's wrong, and I'm not going to, because I was right. It's you don't see yourself properly. You see yourself as, and if you think you're always right and you never need to be forgiven for anything, well, now you're the least forgiving jerk anyone ever know. Well, that's you see this on the pages of scripture, by the way, when Simon invites Jesus over for dinner, and Jesus gets there and Simon doesn't even bother to wash his feet. And then a woman from the city also finds her way into the meal, and she's just lavishing him with her ointment. And Simon's thinking, this dude has no idea who this woman is. And Jesus says to him, well, Simon, let me give you a little story. Can you imagine there's two people who owe some money, and one owes a lot of money, one owes a little bit of money, and the person they owe the money to eventually forgives the debt of both. Who is more grateful? And Simon says, well, the guy who owed the most money. He says, yep, you got it. You're right. And there's the illustration right there. It turns out that this woman knew how much debt she had. And because she knew that debt, she could love, she could forgive. People who don't know they have any debt are just, they're hoarders. They think that they don't need to forget, ever show any affection or any kindness to anybody. It really is a pride issue. And the higher you think, now, why does that matter? Well, it turns out if you study these murders, you'll see that I work guys who are just regular guys. Most of them are guys that do these murders. And when you investigate these, you're going to discover pretty quickly that they're just like you and me. They aren't serial killers. They did one murder 30 years ago, and then they became doctors and cops and firemen and the deacon at your church and the guy who's you asked to watch your kids when you're not there or feed your pets. He's just a regular guy who lives next door. And you think, well, that guy could never have committed a murder, right? I've known him for 30 years. Well, there's the problem. It's understanding what we call the enigma of man. Does Scripture describe us accurately? Because if it does, then I realized, oh, wow. Yeah, it turns out that we're all the same. We're all the same prideful people who think we know better than God. And we all are equally capable. Even if you are someone who's listening to this and you're already a Christ follower, don't think for a second you're not capable of doing something horrific but for the grace of God, but for the circumstances, but for the fact you haven't been triggered, you haven't had your buttons pushed. It turns out everyone I work is like that. Nice, really. I mean, these are people who when I arrested them, I remember arresting one guy and taking him to jail. And at the break, during the criminal trial, he leaned over while the attorneys were at a sidebar with the judge. So it's just me sitting at my table right next to the table that has the defendant. And we knew each other because, I took him to jail. I talked to him 100 times. He leaned over and said, Jim. I said, what? He said, I want you to know I'm leading a Bible study in jail right now. Which he was. Now, so look, it turns out that understanding our human nature, what we call the enigma of man, is super important because it's the key to forgiveness. If you think that there's two categories of people, good and bad, instead of proud and humble, good and bad, then you're never going to you're always going to see yourself as the good one, right? And if that's the case, you're going to think there's two categories of humans. And then you're going to separate from the other category because no, those are bad people. I think when we realize that, no, we're all both of those things, then we are more likely to forgive the other side. And we do this, by the way, not just with strangers. You do this sometimes with people you love, because in any moment you'll think, no, I'm the one who's good here. You're bad. And I'm the one who's right here. You're wrong. And we're unforgiving in moments because, again, we don't even understand. And I think it was great that the studies kind of show this, and I put the studies in the book, that even altruism often, most of the time, is offered for yes, you can be altruistic. You can be, but what is true altruism? In other words, you could do something that looks like you're being altruistic, but it's typically when you're good. You already have resources. You're already fine. You're giving from your surplus. Rather than because if it was a me or you thing, like if there's only toilet paper that's enough for one of us, it's going to be me, right? We saw that in the pandemic. We become hoarders in pandemics because we all suddenly return to our selfishness. And I think that and we all see it. So it's important for us to recognize that's who we are, and then it'll change the way you behave towards. You'll actually reach out and act toward others.
Yeah, yeah, that temptation to be self-centered, really, but self-protecting, self-provision, self-promoting, all the self stuff. It's awful. And of course, pride just sneaks right in there as opposed to the humble. But
isn't
to
it
me,
interesting that the upside down nature of Christianity that says that you have to be humble to be exalted, you have to die to live, you have to rid yourself of self in order to experience anything you will actually enjoy, even in a selfish way. This idea that it's backwards, that I have to give it away. And studies show this, that when people extend grace, they receive the benefits, physiological benefits of those who receive the grace. Fascinating to me that that's the case, right? Because again, it's one of those things that Scripture teaches. Now, look, you could say, well, you know what? That doesn't mean that Christianity is true. It just might mean that it's thoughtful. Okay. But let's face it, if Christianity is true, it ought to also thoughtfully capture us the way we really are. In other words, you could say, I'm not convinced that Christianity is true. I'm just convinced that after thousands of years of thoughtful interaction with humans, that somebody might actually capture us the way we really are. Okay. See, to me, the entry point is going to be whatever you decide as an observer or as an engager. You just look, I, in the end, if you didn't even think Christianity was true, you still ought to live as though it is. And this is what Dawkins, the evolutionary biologist who's been saying in the last month or so overseas, who's written lots of books against Christianity, but says that honestly, he considers himself a cultural Christian in the sense that he would prefer a culture that's been shaped by Christianity to a culture that's been shaped by any other worldview. Again, it's because I think he's basically saying it doesn't matter if it's for him, he thinks that it doesn't have to be true in order for it to be really good. Now, I actually think that it's both true and good. And I think you can make a strong case that if it's not true, why would you think it would be good? How could it be that evolution even would drive us towards a lie so that we could flourish? It seems to me that if evolution is true, it would drive us toward a truth so that we could flourish. And by the way, that's what probably every atheist evolutionist wants to believe anyway. Not that his progress as a human, as a being, as a creature on planet Earth, is consistently driving him toward falsehoods. I think he thinks it's actually or she thinks it's actually driving them towards something that's true. Well, if it turns out that every claim of Christian scripture describes an aspect of human flourishing that you would just blossom under if you simply adopted it, well, it's starting to look like it's true. Maybe we should at least take a look at its claims.
Yeah.
And that's why I don't think Dawkins is any closer to being a Christian than he ever was. But I think it's interesting that he recognizes the value in leveraging what it teaches.
Yeah. Well, let's maybe talk about some hopeful things. There's a lot of depressing things in the world, and these cell phones are happy to bring it to us every moment of the day, scrolling through that thing. And obviously the book about crime and murder and, human nature and human behavior, but give us kind of the upside, the positive side, the hopefulness that we can discover through these things that you find that you wrote about in the book.
Yes. I think first of all, this is what I try to do in every chapter is just talk about the hope that's found on the backside of every one of these observations. Like what is the takeaway that helps us to flourish? So I don't want to write a book about human depravity. I want to write a book about human flourishing. And part of that is like, hey, you have to take these cautionary tales seriously and then take it and leverage it. So there's a part of every chapter called Chasing the Lead, where I just tell you, okay, now that you know this, what can you do to apply this? One of the idea you mentioned, hope. Well, it turns out that hope is one of those areas that has huge impact on just an idea, a view of the world, hopeful view of the world has a huge impact on physical well-being, including your physical well-being. And so I've got a diagram in the book, I'm looking at it right now, that talks about all the ways that hopelessness can impact you negatively. Conversely, hope actually rejuvenates you in all these aspects of your life. But the question then becomes, well, what is it about Christianity that provides hope? Well, now this is a chapter called Every Kind of Stupid. The gospel is the cure for every kind of stupid you can think of. And if you're reading something on your smartphone and you're thinking, well, that's stupid, there's a lot of stuff that we're looking at in the culture and saying, this is a broken thing that is ridiculous, that needs fixing. It's so stupid. I don't know why this has to be the way it is. And we lose hope. I showed a number of studies that show what it is we are hopeless about and what it is we think, well, that's never going to change. That's where hopelessness really finds its language, right? Finds its voice when it says, when you find yourself saying, oh yeah, what's the point? What's the point? It's never going to change. That's true hopelessness. So the idea that what's the point is never going to change is so antithetical to the Christian worldview, because it's a worldview about change. That it turns out that every misbehavior stands on a pedestal called pride. That pedestal has three motives standing on it: pursuit of money, pursuit of sex, pursuit of power. Those three things, sex, money, and power, it's in 1 John 2. but it's also what you'll see if you work true crime cases. Those are the things that lead us down the road to all kinds of problems. If it's government stupid, or marriage stupid, or international conflict stupid, whatever kind of stupid you're thinking of, it's driven by somebody or a group of somebodies who are allowing their pride to get the better of them, and they want gains in sex, money, or power at the expense of others. So it turns out, because all of that pride is the sin that drives every kind of stupid, the only solution you're ever going to find is a solution for sin, a solution for the pride that leads to sin. So you might think there's another system you can put in place, but it's not a system you can put in place. You need a solution for sin. And because the gospel is the solution for sin, it's a cause that we have to start by recognizing that we are sinners. That's where it begins. It is the solution. It is the way to cure every kind of stupid. And so I try to illustrate that in one chapter of this book. But if you're somebody, if nothing else, a lot of why we're hopeless is because we feel like we're going to die and nothing's ever going to change. And even then we fear death half the time. There's another chapter in the book talks about death sentences and why we fear dying. But if you have a view of the world in which, number one, you have a persisting self, this is what the studies call it, that will persist beyond the grave. Two, you believe there's a God you can pray to who actually listens to your prayers, because there's lots of views of God that don't. And the studies show that you have to have a view of God in which you think he's listening to your prayers. And three, has a solution for sin that does not involve your work, because you can never earn it. And you'll always feel like a failure if you try. Well, this now provides unparalleled hope. It turns out, and I remember when Keller used to say this, Tim Keller, I just thought it was so smart the way he would say it, that if you're an atheist, you'll be less content and more miserable and more hopeless if you think deeply about your worldview, because you'll have to admit that there's no point in being here, that the universe doesn't care about you, and everything's going to die eventually, and no one's going to remember you, and you don't really have a legacy because nothing lives beyond the dirt. You start in the dirt, you end in the dirt, and no one remembers what their great grandchildren or great grandparents did, and your great grandchildren won't give a lick about you either. So it turns out that if you think deeply about your atheist worldview, you're going to find yourself in a state of hopelessness. But on the other hand, if you think more deeply about your Christian worldview, just the opposite will be true. And the only Christians who find themselves hopeless are the people who aren't thinking deeply about what it is Christianity is teaching about eternity, about forgiveness, about the persisting self beyond the grave, and about the forgiveness of sins in the gospel. So I think that in the end, yes, it turns out that of all the ways you could look at the world, one way in which suffering is inevitable, just get over it, the universe doesn't care. Another way that says, well, just try to do better in the next life, because the reincarnation is you're just on this perpetual wheel. Or three, all suffering is an illusion because your experience in this world is an illusion. How about this? No, your experience is real, but your life extends forever. And God will right every injustice. He will wipe every tear. He will cure every disease. That your eternity is secure if you trust in Christ. That yourself will persist, not a reincarnated version. All of your memories, all of your friends, all of your relationships, the you know today will persist into eternity. This is the worldview that offers hope. And that's why people who take that worldview seriously are less depressed. The statistics reveal it. These are secular studies, not Christian studies. That if you're allowing your fear, your death anxiety, or your mortality salience, they call it, your consciousness of your own mortality, if you are viewing that through an atheistic worldview, you're far more likely to struggle with this than you would if you feel it if you're viewing it through your Christian worldview. So that's why I think there is hope in the gospel, and that hope, by the way, has actual. You'll see that people who are hopeless, I've listed it here, more likely to have a poor heart health, more likely to experience physical fatigue, more likely to experience and not recover from chronic illness. Hopelessness there's lots of measurements of poorer physical health as a result of chronic hopelessness. So we really need to look at this and say, well, yeah, it turns out that, as you were saying, that one doctor thinks that joy is at the heart of it. Well, probably an aspect of joy is at the heart of it, but it's called hope. And while it's an aspect of joy, it's different, because I can get joy in the burger I'm about to have for lunch, but I won't find any hope in it. And that's why hope is the key to all of this.
Yeah. And I want to encourage you listeners also, like we've talked on some previous shows about identity and what Jim mentioned earlier about the first will be last, or die to self so you can live, all these opposites in the kingdom. When you start to really drill down into what Jesus was teaching, it can transform you. And that's the whole point. I think we're supposed to be, our heart specifically, being transformed by the renewing of our mind. There's ways we think that are not lined up with the way Jesus taught. It's the kingdom
That's right.
of heaven versus the kingdom of darkness, this world. The world's going to try to get our thinker this way and our seer this way, put filters on us. That self-preservation, that self-centeredness, the world is going to get you focused on self, where Jesus came to say, no, look, you can trust, number one, God in heaven created you, knows you, put a specific call on your life. You can trust that love that he created you to be, walk in identity-wise. Christ in us, we're in him seated in heavenly places. If we can really start to nail this gospel of the kingdom, then we can for sure have hope. And then we can trust in something beyond ourselves. And then we can love our neighbor, not have to worry about jealousy and competition and all this garbage that get us sucked back into the world's way of looking and believing. So our believer, if we can renew this mind by the word and trusting that word. But guys, I encourage you to get the book, especially if there's, well, in your own life too, but just friends, family, anyone who's got those tough questions about suffering and human nature in general. The Truth and True Crime is a great book. Cold Case Christianity, my favorite from the original. And Jim's got a lot of other good books too. But Jim, what's the best way for people to follow you, get the book, just kind of keep in touch with what you're doing?
Of course, we still write every 3 times a week at coldcasechristianity.com. But for this book, what I wanted to do is to get to anyone who purchases this book, and you can go to thetruthandtruecrime.com, thetruthandtruecrime.com to get it. We have the 30-session, 10.5-hour case makers course. So if you wanted to be able to kind of refresh in your own mind the evidence for the resurrection, the evidence for the reliability of Scripture from Cold Case Christianity and God's crime scene and forensic faith, and even person of interest, all of that stuff is in that course. So my goal is to help you to kind of have confidence so that your hope is well placed. And that course is available for anyone who buys the book at thetruthandtruecrime.com.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that evidence is just so powerful for the intellectual mind. And so many people are just stuck in that intellectual, prove it to me, evidence-based medicine. That's what medical school taught us. We got to bring the evidence, bring the proof, or I'm not going to listen to it. And unfortunately, we've submitted to that secular system so much. So it's very powerful to be able to look at some evidence and bring that evidence to the table to get the mind and the intellect to be able to receive these deeper truths that I think are more the right brain relational that we talked about last week. Y'all go listen to that show from last week, the other half of church. Michael Hendricks talking about the more relational identity stuff. But that left brain's there too. And it's been encouraged and uplifted and stewarded so well that it's good to have these intellectual, factual, black and white, knowledge-based things. At least it was for me. And maybe that's just because I'm bent so hard that way. You know, my wife, when I was going through this season of life, getting all this evidence for Genesis, evidence for the Bible, and bringing it home to her, she would, real supportive and loving, but basically say, that's nice, honey, but why don't you just believe? The Bible says it, just believe it. So J. Warner Wallace, thank you for the part you played in my life on bringing some of that evidence so that my intellectual left brain mind could be satisfied and my right brain mind could be nourished better through that spiritual relationship with God directly, who I believe, guys, does want to speak to you directly and draw you to him. He wants to know you, wants to have a relationship with you. So, all right. Jim, thanks a lot for being with us. Everybody, this is the book one more time, The Truth and True Crime. Y'all check that out. Get a copy, get your family, friends a copy. Jim, we'll have to have you back again. Thanks a lot for spending the hour with us.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate you.
All right, everybody. I'm Dr. Ben Edwards. We'll see you next week. VeritasWellnessMember.com. That allows us to educate on diet and lifestyle things to the whole world and not worry about crossing state lines and practicing medicine. Guys, you're the cure. That's not a slogan. Epigenetics, these genes are turned on and off by things under your control. By sitting all day long, that turns on certain genes you don't want to turn on. By being under artificial light all day long instead of sunlight, by not breathing deeply, these shallow breaths from being fight or flight mode, the flexor muscles all clenched, you don't get a deep belly breath. That impacts your mitochondria, of course, the food. But guys, this thinking, it's a big, big deal. So we'll continue these discussions and more in future shows. Go to the website to look on the podcast archive page. This show will be on there. Years ago when I talked to Jim, it's on there. Go check that one out and many more, guys. So we'll see you next week. Thanks for joining us today.